Tommy "Red" Sullivan, the ruthless mastermind, and his right-hand man, Michael "Mick" Carver, built the most feared criminal empire Liverpool had ever seen. From the shadows of the city's dark alleyways to the bustling docks where cocaine shipments flowed freely, they ruled with an iron fist. But when betrayal tore their empire apart, the very men they trusted most turned against them. In a deadly game of loyalty and power, their rise was meteoric, but their fall was swift, brutal, and inevitable. This is the true story of the Red Crew, an empire built on blood, betrayal, and an insatiable thirst for control. In the early 1990s, Liverpool's docklands were a breeding ground for opportunity, an area known for its crime-ridden streets, where smuggling and illicit activities thrived in the shadows. It was here that a group of ruthless individuals with no ties to the city's traditional gangs began to carve out their own empire. They called themselves the Red Crew. Their name, like their reputation, would soon echo across Europe, as they built an empire from the very veins of the city. At first, the Red Crew's operations were small, almost invisible. They started by controlling a few low-level drug deals, slipping through the cracks where larger criminal organizations overlooked. But this wasn't the work of amateurs. The crew was led by an individual whose ability to read people and manipulate situations set him apart from the rest. He knew that the key to rising above the city's criminal chaos wasn't just violence, it was control. And control meant building alliances, not just with local criminals, but with people in power. They began using Liverpool's docks as a key entry point for cocaine, strategically positioning themselves in the global drug trade. They didn't just buy from the cartels, they worked with them. What gave the crew their edge was their ability to remain under the radar. They never made a show of their power, they operated in the shadows, hidden behind legitimate businesses, ensuring that their illegal activities never became public knowledge. They built relationships with corrupt officials and law enforcement officers, buying loyalty with bribes and threats. Anyone who didn't fall in line either disappeared or was silenced permanently. As a result, the crew's influence spread like a virus, infecting every level of society, from dock workers and street dealers to politicians and businessmen. By the late 1990s, the crew was no longer just a group of street thugs. They had transformed into a sophisticated criminal empire, with their operations reaching far beyond Liverpool. Their cocaine shipments became a steady flow, fueling demand across the UK. The money poured in, and so did the violence. Rival gangs, once bold enough to challenge them, were wiped out in cold-blooded fashion. Fear became their currency, and loyalty was bought and sold. Every deal, every alliance was calculated. The Red Crew had a single goal: domination. The streets of Liverpool may have seemed unchanged to outsiders, but beneath the surface, the Red Crew had built something far darker. A growing criminal empire that was about to transform the city forever. As the Red Crew's power grew, so did their ambition. What began as a small-time operation soon turned into something far more dangerous. And they knew that to maintain control, they needed to secure more than just the loyalty of low-level dealers. The crew understood that their real strength lay in alliances. They began to expand their network, quietly pulling strings in the shadows, forming ties not only with other criminals but with people who could protect their interests in the open world. The crew wasn't just building a criminal organization, they were constructing an empire. They reached out to corrupt politicians, some of whom were easily swayed with money, others by promises of protection. In exchange for their influence, these officials allowed the crew to operate with relative impunity. The docks, already a hotbed for illegal trade, became a fortress for their cocaine shipments, which were moving faster and more efficiently than anyone could have predicted. But the crew's empire wasn't limited to just drugs. They soon had their fingers in all sorts of illicit activities. Protection rackets, money laundering, and even arms trafficking became part of their portfolio, all executed with the same cold precision that defined their rise. At the same time, the crew managed to infiltrate local law enforcement. They didn't need to have officers on the take at every level, just enough to shield their operations from prying eyes. A few high-ranking police officials, who had their own vices, became loyal to the crew, allowing the gang to avoid suspicion or interference. The crew's rise was built on calculated risk and ruthless efficiency, and their network stretched further than anyone could have imagined. They weren't just a gang, they were a machine that oiled itself with fear, money, and power. The crew also expanded their reach beyond Liverpool, forging ties with international criminal organizations. The Colombian cartels, notorious for their control over the global cocaine trade, recognized the crew's potential as a key distributor in Europe. In exchange for a cut of the profits, the Red Crew received a steady flow of high-quality cocaine, which they distributed through their well-established network of contacts. What was once a local operation became a continental enterprise, with shipments arriving in Liverpool from South America and making their way into cities across the UK and Europe. But power, as always, comes at a price. As their empire expanded, the crew became more brazen, more willing to eliminate anyone who dared to challenge their authority. Yet, even as they expanded their network and fortified their hold on Liverpool, cracks were starting to form. No empire, no matter how formidable, could ever be completely secure. The more they gained, the more they risked losing. By the turn of the millennium, the Red Crew had become an unstoppable force, and cocaine was the lifeblood of their empire. Their operation was seamless, an intricate network of suppliers, distributors, and money launderers working in perfect harmony. The docks of Liverpool, once known for their industrial hustle, had been transformed into a gateway for a new kind of trade, one that moved millions of pounds in cocaine, hidden inside shipping containers, from the underbelly of Colombia to the streets of the UK. The crew's ability to handle such a complex operation with efficiency and secrecy was what set them apart. They had an almost uncanny understanding of logistics, using trusted couriers to transport the drugs into warehouses, where they were packaged and distributed with military precision. Cocaine shipments were carefully planned, arriving in waves that were almost impossible to track. Every move was calculated, with every detail thought through, from the routes taken to avoid law enforcement, to the coded language used to ensure that no one could betray them. The money began to pour in, creating a never-ending cycle of wealth that fed their criminal empire. The crew's leaders weren't just criminals, they had become businessmen, and their empire ran like a corporation. They had a network of people who worked in legitimate businesses, from construction companies to nightclubs, all of which provided a perfect front for their illegal operations. These legitimate businesses also served as a laundering mechanism for the millions of pounds they were making. There was no visible gap between the crew's legal enterprises and their illicit activities, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to pinpoint where the criminal activities began and ended. The crew's reach extended far beyond Liverpool. By this point, their distribution network was sprawling, stretching from the north of England to the south, with connections throughout Europe. Cities like Manchester, London, and Birmingham were prime markets, and the crew made sure to have their hands in every corner of the continent. They didn't just sell drugs, they created entire ecosystems of criminal operations that made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to track down the source. Anyone who attempted to interfere, from rival gangs to law enforcement, was dealt with swiftly and brutally. However, with their ever-growing wealth and influence, the crew's notoriety began to spread. While they had once thrived in the shadows, their expanding operations meant more attention, and with that attention came greater risk. The allure of cocaine made their empire nearly impossible to resist, but it also brought a level of exposure they hadn't anticipated. As their name became synonymous with power and violence, the crew began to realize that the bigger they grew, the more fragile their hold on everything became. But at that moment, they were untouchable, and nothing seemed capable of bringing their empire down. As the Red Crew's empire flourished, the cost of their rise to power became ever more apparent. For every pound of cocaine they moved, there was blood spilled in the streets. The crew didn't just control the drug trade, they ruled through fear, eliminating anyone who dared to challenge their authority or threaten their operations. Their violence was swift, calculated, and above all, unrelenting. It was the dark undercurrent that held their entire empire together. Rival gangs, once confident in their own power, quickly learned that challenging the crew wasn't just dangerous, it was lethal. The Red Crew didn't hesitate to eliminate competition, either by taking out the leaders or by orchestrating brutal attacks that left no survivors. Entire families were wiped out in acts of terror, designed to send a message to anyone thinking of stepping into the crew's territory. But the violence wasn't limited to just rivals. Within the crew, any hint of betrayal or disloyalty was met with a terrifying finality. Informants were silenced before they could speak, and those who failed to live up to the crew's ruthless standards vanished into the night without a trace. This constant threat of death and retribution created a culture of loyalty that was both powerful and terrifying. Fear kept the ranks in line, but it also bred resentment. While the crew's leadership enjoyed the fruits of their empire, luxury cars, expensive homes, and lavish parties, the men and women working for them in the shadows began to feel the weight of their actions. Many had come from nothing, lured into the world of drugs by promises of money and power. But over time, the constant fear of betrayal began to wear on them. They feared their every move was being watched, that they might be the next one to fall victim to the crew's unrelenting wrath. Yet, in the chaos of violence, there was also a more subtle cost to the crew's reign. The higher-ups became consumed by paranoia. They began to question each other's loyalty, believing that every misstep, every failure to execute a plan perfectly, was a sign of treachery. Even the smallest mistake could be seen as a threat, and the leaders began turning on each other, fearing that their empire might crumble from within. This sense of distrust festered like a disease, poisoning the very core of the crew's operation. It was a subtle shift, but one that would have disastrous consequences. Despite the growing unease, the Red Crew's empire continued to expand. Their name was feared across the country, and their wealth seemed limitless, but in the shadows, the seeds of their destruction had already been sown. Betrayal was in the air, and the empire that had been built on fear was slowly starting to unravel. In 2004, the unthinkable happened. A betrayal that sent shockwaves through the Red Crew and began the slow, inevitable collapse of their empire. One of the crew's most trusted lieutenants, a man who had been with them since their earliest days, made the decision to flip. It wasn't an impulsive choice, it was calculated. For years he had watched the crew grow more violent, more paranoid, and more unhinged. The promises of wealth and power had lost their appeal as he witnessed the increasing bloodshed, both within the crew and around them. He knew he couldn't escape the spiral of violence without doing something drastic. His decision to cooperate with law enforcement was the tipping point. He had inside knowledge that could destroy everything the crew had built. He knew about their cocaine shipments, their money laundering methods, the names of their international contacts, and the corrupt officials who turned a blind eye. The information he provided to authorities was like a treasure trove, a complete blueprint of the crew's operations, from the docks of Liverpool to the far reaches of Europe. This wasn't just a rat trying to save himself, this was a calculated strike that would over time bring the empire to its knees. But the betrayal was not immediately discovered. For months, the crew operated under the belief that everything was running smoothly. Their shipments continued to flow in undisturbed. Their rivals were still being wiped off the map, and the money kept rolling in. However, something felt off to the higher-ups. Small inconsistencies began to crop up. Intelligence about their activities started getting to law enforcement faster than it should have. One of their key distribution channels was raided, and crucial shipments were intercepted. At first, the crew thought it was just bad luck, but soon it became clear someone inside was feeding information to the police. The paranoia within the crew intensified. No one knew who the informant was, but the fear of being betrayed consumed them. The once unified gang was now a collection of men looking over their shoulders, unsure of who could be trusted. Allegiances began to shift. Some of the crew's lower-tier members, sensing the instability, started making deals with rival gangs, positioning themselves to take over when the empire inevitably fell. But even the most loyal members had no idea how deep the betrayal went. As the investigation into the crew intensified, the truth began to surface. The authorities had managed to infiltrate the inner circle, and the details they uncovered were staggering. Law enforcement now had all the tools they needed to dismantle the crew's operations, piece by piece. But as the authorities closed in, the Red Crew's response was swift and brutal. Anyone who even hinted at disloyalty was quickly silenced. Despite their efforts to protect the empire, it was clear that the foundation had already cracked. What had once seemed like an impenetrable criminal organization was slowly unraveling from within that no one was prepared to fill. And in their place, the crew's lower ranks began to disintegrate, unwilling to risk their lives for an organization that was falling apart at the seams. At first, the crew tried to regroup. They held emergency meetings, strategized, and attempted to track down the informants within their ranks. But as the net tightened, more and more of their key players were either arrested or disappeared. The crew's once solid operations began to fracture. Shipments were delayed, routes were compromised, and entire networks of distribution collapsed. The logistical genius that had once made the crew's operations so effective now seemed like a distant memory, overtaken by chaos and fear. The cocaine shipments, once a steady river of wealth, were now being intercepted and destroyed. What had once been a well-oiled machine now seemed like a sinking ship. The crew's leadership was shattered, uncertain, and in hiding. Some tried to flee the country, others went underground, while the most desperate began to turn on each other. Old rivalries flared up as members who once operated in unity began to scramble for any scraps of power that remained. Rumors of betrayal ran rampant. Those left in the crew no longer trusted their fellow members, let alone the corrupt officials who had once protected them. The crew's reputation for ruthless efficiency and deadly violence was no longer enough to shield them from the law. The authorities were closing in on the final pieces of the puzzle. Investigators, armed with months of intelligence, finally pinpointed the source of the leaks. They discovered that the betrayer wasn't just any low-level member, but one of the crew's very own leaders, a trusted ally who had been feeding information to law enforcement for years. The shock of this revelation reverberated through the remains of the crew like a final blow, marking the end of an empire built on trust, fear, and secrecy. The Red Crew was no longer a criminal force to be reckoned with. They were a fragmented, broken organization, struggling to survive. The fall of the empire had begun in earnest, and there was no coming back. As the investigation into the Red Crew's operations continued to unfold, law enforcement began to uncover the full scale of their empire. An empire that had operated with ruthless precision for over a decade. But the more the authorities learned, the more they realized just how complex and far-reaching the crew's network was. The crew didn't just control Liverpool's drug trade. They had their hands in nearly every major criminal operation across the UK. Their ties to international cartels, corrupt officials, and even legitimate businesses made dismantling the empire a monumental task. It wasn't just about breaking the crew's leadership. It was about unraveling an entire web of connections, some of which had been carefully constructed over years, if not decades. The authorities knew they couldn't just make arrests and hope for the best. They needed to be strategic. They set their sights on the crew's weakest points: money laundering operations, smuggling routes, and front businesses. It wasn't just about seizing drugs. It was about cutting off the revenue streams that funded the crew's operations. Every day, new pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The crew's sprawling network of warehouses, safe houses, and storage units were raided one after another. The sheer scale of the operation stunned even seasoned investigators. Hidden compartments, false walls, and sophisticated encryption systems were uncovered in nearly every location, a testament to the crew's commitment to secrecy and survival. But even as the law began to make significant inroads into the crew's operations, the real work had just begun. With each arrest, with each seizure, more people began to talk. Lower-level members, once loyal to the crew's iron-fisted leaders, started to open up. As they faced mounting pressure from investigators, they revealed crucial details about the crew's inner workings, their ties to the Colombian cartels, and the complex routes the cocaine took from South America to the streets of the UK. The more they talked, the closer the authorities came to exposing the full scope of the crew's influence. Yet, Despite the growing mountain of evidence and the increasing arrests, the crew's leadership was elusive. The masterminds behind the empire had gone into hiding, disappearing into the shadows of the criminal world they once dominated. The authorities, despite their successes, were still in the dark about the true structure of the crew's hierarchy. It was becoming clear that the operation wasn't just a simple network of criminals. It was a highly organized, almost corporate-like structure, where every member had a specific role to play. As the investigation deepened, the crew's surviving leaders worked frantically to keep their empire from falling apart completely. Some attempted to flee the country, while others tried to erase evidence of their operations. But it was too late. Law enforcement had already infiltrated their ranks, and the net was closing in. Even as the crew's power waned, their reputation for ruthless efficiency held sway in the criminal world. Rivals who had once feared them now saw an opportunity to move in, taking advantage of the crew's fractured state to carve out their own territories. What seemed like a series of isolated busts had slowly transformed into a coordinated effort to dismantle a global criminal network. The crew's empire, once thought untouchable, was on the verge of collapse. But with each arrest, with each new revelation, it became clearer. The fall of the Red Crew was not just a blow to Liverpool's underworld, it was a seismic shift that would leave a vacuum in the criminal landscape, one that others would be eager to fill. The final chapter in the crew's downfall was fast approaching, and with it, the shocking truths that had been buried deep within the organization. The Red Crew's grip on Liverpool was slipping, but their response was not one of surrender. It was one of desperation. As the authorities closed in, the crew's remaining leaders moved quickly to fortify their positions, trying to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their empire. They had built an intricate criminal network, but now it seemed it was all unraveling at once. They had survived for so long by staying under the radar, relying on secrecy and intimidation to keep the law at bay. But now that their empire was collapsing from within, they found themselves cornered, unsure of how to respond. In a last-ditch effort to regain control, the crew attempted to re-establish their dominance on the streets. Their remaining enforcers, fiercely loyal to the old ways, went into overdrive. The streets of Liverpool, once a place where the crew had ruled with impunity, became a battleground. Shootouts between rival factions, as well as between law enforcement and crew members, became common occurrences. The crew's old reputation for violence was reignited, but this time, it was more chaotic and desperate than ever. Their members, now scattered and fragmented, began to fight among themselves for scraps of the power that had once been theirs. At the same time, those still loyal to the crew tried to salvage the drug trade, desperately attempting to keep the flow of cocaine moving through Liverpool's docks. But the authorities had anticipated this. In a series of coordinated strikes, the police intercepted several of the crew's most important shipments. The cocaine was seized, and once again the crew's money-making machine was forced into disarray. The authorities weren't just focusing on the crew's leaders, they had cut off their supply lines, targeted their distribution channels, and effectively decimated the heart of the operation. But the crew wasn't without resources. Some of their remaining leaders, knowing that the law was closing in, attempted to flee. They used the same network of corrupt officials and contacts that had kept them safe for so many years to attempt one final escape. Some managed to get out of the UK, slipping away under false identities, while others went deeper into hiding, relying on the underworld's vast network of safe houses. However, the authorities were relentless. As each leader disappeared, a team of investigators was hot on their trail, using every tool at their disposal, from surveillance to international cooperation with foreign agencies, to track them down. Despite their best efforts, the crew's downfall seemed inevitable. The longer they stayed hidden, the more the world around them seemed to change. Their allies were turning on them, either seeking to distance themselves from the chaos or take over their operation. The Colombian cartels, once the crew's allies in the cocaine trade, had begun to look elsewhere for distribution partners. Their shipments were no longer as reliable, and their European distribution was crumbling. What had once been a flourishing operation now looked like a relic of a bygone era, with no one willing to keep it alive. As the authorities continued to close in, the crew's influence in Liverpool began to dissipate. The city, once under the heavy thumb of their empire, started to breathe again. But it wasn't the end of the story, not by a long shot. The collapse of the Red Crew created a vacuum in the city's criminal world, and that vacuum was soon filled by others eager to claim a piece of the spoils. But for now, the Crew's fall had become the stuff of local legend, a cautionary tale of an empire that had risen too high and fallen too fast. The once untouchable Red Crew was now a shadow of its former self, and its reign of terror was over. For the first time in over a decade, the streets of Liverpool were free from the Crew's grip. But how long would that freedom last? Only time would tell. Years passed, and the dust that followed the Red Crew's downfall began to settle, but the legacy they left behind was far from erased. While the immediate threat of their reign of terror had ended, the ripple effects of their empire continued to haunt Liverpool. The criminal underworld, now fragmented and chaotic, had never fully recovered from the Crew's collapse. New factions had taken root, and the city had been reshaped by their violence and power struggles. The old criminals, many of whom had once been in the Crew's inner circle, had either disappeared into hiding, moved abroad, or were picked off one by law enforcement. But the void left behind was always filled, and it was clear that the criminal cycle was, if anything, a continual one. Law enforcement, though successful in dismantling the Crew, was faced with new challenges. The once dominant players in the cocaine trade had been replaced by more elusive and unpredictable rivals. The methods of distribution had changed. The Red Crew's ability to keep their operations under wraps had been unmatched. But now, without a central figure or leadership, the new players had no such cohesion. This lack of structure created opportunities for the police, but it also meant that the old strategies were no longer as effective. The authorities continued to make inroads into smaller gangs, but the bigger picture was harder to control. The remnants of the Crew's criminal network were still embedded deep in the city's fabric, and as long as drugs flowed into the UK, the problem was far from solved. Despite the chaos, a quiet victory had emerged for the people of Liverpool. With the Crew's dominance shattered, neighborhoods once held in the grip of fear began to heal. The local communities, still scarred by years of violence and intimidation, started to rebuild. Businesses that had once been forced to pay protection money to the Crew began to operate more freely, and families that had lived in constant dread now had a sense of peace, however fragile. There was no denying that the Crew had left a deep mark on the city, but as the years wore on, it became clear that their influence was fading from the streets, and with that the people began to reclaim their own lives. However, the story of the Red Crew was not one of a simple defeat. The collapse of their empire had revealed dark truths